A small city without walls and without an army wakes up surrounded by an entire troop sent by a furious king. But the target was not a general, nor a military commander. It was an unarmed prophet named Elisha. When everything seemed lost, a simple prayer revealed that the true army was already there, invisible but positioned. And on that morning it became clear that open eyes can be more powerful than unsheathed swords. Before we begin, write in the comments where you are watching from. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. We continue. The sun had not yet risen when Elisha's servant opened the door of the house in Dothan. What he saw locked his legs in place. Horses, chariots, Syrian soldiers on all sides. The most feared army of the Middle East had surrounded the entire city during the night with a single objective: to capture an unarmed man, a prophet. The servant ran inside in panic, but Elisha did not even get up. To understand what happened that morning, it is necessary to go back a few months in time. Israel and Syria lived in constant war. It was not just any conflict. It was a brutal territorial dispute that had already lasted generations, with borders that advanced and retreated at the mercy of battles. The king of Syria at that time was Ben-Hadad, an experienced commander who knew every ambush tactic, every supply route, every weak point of the Israelite territory. His army was feared throughout the region: war chariots pulled by trained horses, elite archers, heavy infantry. The Syrian military machine had no rival in the region. Ben-Hadad planned his campaigns with surgical precision. He personally chose the locations where he would set up camp, the valleys where he would position ambushes, the routes through which he would attack. This information was shared only with his innermost circle of generals. No one else knew. No one else could know. But something strange began to happen. Every time the Syrian army marched for an ambush, the Israelites had already evacuated the area. Every time Ben-Hadad chose a strategic camping location, the troops of Israel appeared first. Every time a surprise attack was planned, the king of Israel seemed to know exactly where and when it would come. Not once, not twice. The biblical text in 2 Kings chapter 6 says that this happened repeatedly. The Hebrew word used indicates frequency. It was not coincidence, it was a pattern. Ben-Hadad became furious. He gathered his officers and asked the obvious question: who was the traitor? Someone in the high command was leaking information to the enemy. There was no other explanation. One of his trusted men was selling military secrets to Israel. The king wanted names. He wanted the spy identified. He wanted blood. The answer he received left him disconcerted. One of his counselors stepped forward and said that none of them was a traitor. The problem, he explained, was a prophet in Israel named Elisha. This man, according to the counselor, revealed to the king of Israel even the words that Ben-Hadad spoke in his own bedchamber. The general was not exaggerating. Elisha's reputation had already crossed borders. He was known as someone who operated on a level of perception that defied any military or political logic. It was not espionage. It was something the Syrians could not categorize. Ben-Hadad made a decision. If the problem was a single man, the solution was to eliminate this man. He sent scouts to discover where Elisha was. The information came back fast. The prophet had been seen in Dothan, a small city about 20 kilometers north of Samaria. It was not a fortress. It did not have a significant military garrison. It was just a common city, with modest walls and a civilian population. Perfect. The king did not send a squad. He did not send a detachment. He dispatched an entire army, horses, chariots, and a great military force. These are the exact words of the Hebrew text. Historians estimate that a Syrian great force of the time could include between 2,000 and 5,000 soldiers, besides hundreds of war chariots. Each chariot typically carried 3 men: a driver, a shield-bearer, and an archer. They were heavy combat vehicles, plated with metal, pulled by war horses trained not to retreat before noise or blood. The sound of a column of Syrian chariots in movement could be heard kilometers away. The ground shook. But Ben-Hadad did not want Elisha to hear. He wanted Elisha to wake up surrounded, without exit, without chance of escape. Therefore, he ordered the force to march at night. Moving an army of this size in the dark was risky. Horses could Stumble, chariots could break wheels on irregular terrain, soldiers could disperse. But the king assumed the risk. When the sun rose, Dothan would be completely enveloped by Syrian iron. That was exactly what happened. Elisha's servant woke up that morning and did what he probably did every day. Opened the door to check the weather, look at the horizon, start the routine. What he found was a nightmare. In whatever direction he looked, there were soldiers. The hills around Dothan, which normally showed only olive trees and pastures, were covered in metal, spears, shields, Syrian banners. The entire city was enveloped by a ring of death. There was nowhere to escape. The servant ran back inside and woke Elisha with the news. His words, recorded in the biblical text, reveal the size of the despair. "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" It was a rhetorical question. They could do nothing. An elderly prophet and his servant against thousands of professional soldiers. The mathematics was simple. Death was certain. Elisha's response defies any human logic. He told the servant not to fear. He said that those who were with them were more than those who were with the Syrians. The servant must have thought the master had gone mad. More. They were two. Outside there was an army. How could two be more than thousands? Elisha did not explain. He did not argue. He did not try to convince with words. Instead, he prayed a simple prayer. He asked the Lord to open the servant's eyes so that he could see. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary moments in all Scripture. The servant's eyes were opened, not the physical eyes, which were already functioning perfectly, but a capacity of perception that normally remains closed. And when this new vision activated, the servant saw the mountain full of horses and chariots of fire around Elisha. The Hebrew word used for full is the same used to describe a vessel overflowing. There was no empty space. Every meter of that mountain was occupied by celestial force, horses of fire, chariots of fire. The description is specific and consistent with other angelic appearances in the biblical text. When Elijah, Elisha's master, was taken to heaven years before, the vehicle used was exactly the same. A chariot of fire with horses of fire. It was not a metaphor. It was the way these beings manifested themselves when they needed to be seen by human eyes. Fire in the Scriptures appears repeatedly as a mark of the divine presence. The bush that Moses saw burned but was not consumed. The pillar that guided Israel in the desert was of fire by night. The Lord descended upon Sinai in fire. When the seraphim appear in Isaiah's vision, they are described as burning beings. The very word seraphim comes from the Hebrew root that means to burn. The fire was not destruction, it was glory. It was the visual signature of the spiritual world invading the material world. What the servant saw that morning was an army in battle formation, horses positioned, chariots ready. It was not a decorative apparition or a vision to comfort. It was a real military force, as real as the Syrian one, only operating in a dimension that normally remains hidden. The angels were not there to keep Elisha company. They were there to protect him, and they were in much greater number than the attackers. The text does not give exact numbers for the celestial army, but the description suggests something massive. If the Syrians had thousands, the angels had more. If the Syrian chariots covered the hills, the chariots of fire covered the entire mountain until overflowing. The disparity was so great that Elisha could say with absolute calm that there was no reason for fear. He was not being brave. He was being mathematical. The battle was already decided before it began. But there was no battle, not in the conventional sense. When the Syrians began to descend toward Dothan to capture the prophet, Elisha prayed another prayer. This time he asked the Lord to strike that people with blindness, and immediately the entire army lost their sight. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of horsemen, dozens of commanders, all blind at the same time. The chaos must have been immense. Horses without direction, chariots colliding, soldiers stumbling over each other. The most feared military machine of the region transformed instantly into a confused mass of disoriented men. Elisha then did something unexpected. He went out of the city and went to meet the blind army. He told the Syrians that they were on the wrong path, that that was not the right city, and that he would guide them to the man they sought. The soldiers completely dependent now on any available help, followed the prophet's voice. They had no choice. Blind in enemy territory, without navigation capacity, they accepted the guidance of a stranger. Elisha led them for 20 kilometers to Samaria. Samaria was the capital of the kingdom of Israel. It had high walls, a permanent garrison, and was full of Israelite soldiers. When the Syrian army entered through the city gates, they still did not know where they were. Only when they crossed the walls, Elisha prayed a third prayer. He asked the Lord to open their eyes, and they saw. They saw that they were in the center of the enemy capital. They saw that they were surrounded by Israelite forces on all sides. They saw that their weapons would be of no use now. The hunter had become the hunted. The army that came to capture a prophet was now completely at the mercy of that same prophet. The king of Israel, seeing the situation, became euphoric. He asked Elisha if he should kill the prisoners. It was the obvious answer. Those men had come with murderous intent. They had surrounded an Israelite city. They had threatened a prophet of the Lord. Execution would be justified by any military code of the time. Furthermore, eliminating a force of that size would be a devastating blow to Syria. Ben-Hadad would lose thousands of trained soldiers at once. The strategic advantage would be enormous. Elisha said no. The prophet asked the king if he would kill men whom he had captured with his own sword and bow. The question had a precise logic. The king had not captured that army. He had not fought. He had not risked a single soldier. The victory was not his to administer, it belonged to the Lord. And the Lord had other plans. Elisha ordered a banquet to be prepared. The same soldiers who came to kill were served with bread and water in abundance. Tables were set. Food was served. The invading army was treated not as prisoners of war, but as guests of honor. After they ate and drank, they were released. They returned to their master in safety, fed without a single wound. The result surprised even the biblical chroniclers. The text says that after this episode, the Syrian troops did not return to the land of Israel anymore. The Hebrew word indicates a complete cessation, at least for a significant period. Ben-Hadad, the king who had sent an entire army to capture a man, received that army back intact, well-fed and completely humiliated. What could he do with this information? His soldiers had experienced supernatural power firsthand. They had been blinded, guided, captured and forgiven, all by forces they could not explain or fight. Attacking Israel again would mean facing not only human soldiers, but the God who commanded horses of fire. The episode reveals several layers of reality that normally remain hidden. The first is that the visible world is not all that exists. Elisha's servant had perfect vision. His eyes functioned normally, but he could not see what was right before him. The horses and chariots of fire were there all the time. They did not appear in response to the prayer. The prayer only allowed the servant to see them. The protection already existed. The force was already positioned. What was missing was perception. The second layer is that divine protection does not depend on human circumstances. Elisha was in absolute numerical disadvantage. He had no army. He had no weapons. He had no visible allies. Any strategic analysis would say that he was lost. But strategic analysis could not account for what it could not see. And what it could not see was precisely the decisive factor. The third layer concerns the nature of angels. The biblical text does not describe them as ethereal figures playing the harp. It describes them as a military force, war horses, combat chariots, tactical formation. The angels in Dothan were ready to fight if necessary. They did not fight because they did not need to. The blindness resolved the situation without violence, but the capacity was there. The writer to the Hebrews centuries later would call angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation. The ministry included, when necessary, armed protection. The fourth layer involves Elisha's response to danger. He did not panic. He did not flee. He did not try to negotiate. His calm did not come from denial. He knew exactly what was outside. It came from superior information. Elisha knew something that his servant ignored, that the Syrians ignored, that the king of Israel himself ignored. And this knowledge completely transformed his assessment of the situation. Fear is often the result of incomplete information. When you know what Elisha knew, fear loses its meaning. The fifth layer lies in the merciful outcome. God could have destroyed the Syrian army. The horses of fire could have descended and annihilated every soldier. The blindness could have been permanent. The capture in Samaria could have ended in execution. But none of that happened. Instead of destruction, there was a banquet. Instead of death, there was liberation. The power demonstrated in Dothan was not just power to protect, it was power to transform enemies into guests. This choice was not weakness, it was divine. Strategy operating on a logic different from the human one. Killing the Syrians would solve the immediate problem, but would create a thirst for vengeance. Feeding them and releasing them created something that no sword can create: perplexity. The soldiers returned home unable to explain what they had experienced, and this inability to explain generated a form of respect that fear would never produce. The prophet Elisha lived in a particularly turbulent period of Israel's history. The kingdom was divided, idolatry had spread, kings often ignored the commandments, but God continued operating, continued protecting, continued revealing that there was more happening than the eyes could capture. Elisha was the point of contact between these two realities. He transited between the visible and the invisible with a naturalness that disconcerted everyone around. The episode in Dothan was not unique in Elisha's career. Before this, he had multiplied oil for an indebted widow. He had purified contaminated waters. He had raised the son of a Shunammite woman. He had neutralized poison in a pot of stew. Each of these events demonstrated the same principle. There is a reality beyond the apparent, and this reality can burst into the material world when God decides it is time. But the vision in Dothan was different in a crucial aspect. In the other miracles, Elisha acted and the result appeared. In Dothan, the result already existed. It only needed to be revealed. The horses and chariots of fire were not created at that moment. They were there before. They would be there after. The prophet's prayer did not move God to send protection. The prayer opened the servant's eyes to see the protection that had already been sent. This changes everything. If protection needed to be asked for to exist, then every time someone forgot to ask, they would be unprotected. But if protection already exists and prayer only reveals what is already there, then despair loses its foundation. The situation in Dothan was desperate only for those who did not have complete information. For those who saw the whole picture, it was a demonstration of overwhelming force in favor of Israel. Psalm 91 speaks of angels appointed to guard the righteous in all his ways. Psalm 34 says that the angel of the Lord camps around those who fear him and delivers them. Daniel was protected by an angel in the lion's den. Peter was freed from prison by an angel who opened iron gates. In Dothan, the veil was briefly lifted to show what normally remains hidden. Angels are not an exception. They are the rule. They are always there. We simply do not see them. The writers of the New Testament were fully aware of this reality. Jesus said he could ask the Father and receive more than 12 legions of angels, the equivalent of more than 72,000 celestial beings. The writer to the Hebrews asked if all angels were not ministering spirits. The implied answer was yes. Paul wrote about principalities and powers, about spiritual forces operating in heavenly places. Elisha's vision was not an anomaly. It was a window into the normal functioning of the universe. What does this mean for those who read this story 3 millennia later? It means that the visual assessment of any situation is necessarily incomplete. Eyes capture light reflected on material objects. They do not capture what exists beyond that narrow range of perception. When the servant looked at the hills of Dothan, he saw the totality of what his eyes could register, and that totality did not include horses of fire. But the horses were there. The limitation was of the instrument, not of reality. It also means that moments of apparent vulnerability can be moments of maximum protection. Elisha was never safer than when he was surrounded. The amount of celestial force positioned around him was proportional to the threat he faced. If the Syrians had sent more soldiers, it is reasonable to assume that more angels would have been assigned. The protection scaled with the danger. What seemed like a siege was in truth an escort. It means finally that Elisha's prayer, "Lord, open his eyes," remains available. Not as a magic formula for spectacular visions, but as a recognition that there is more than we can process. Biblical faith was never blind faith. It was always faith informed by a reality that transcends the senses. Abraham believed because God spoke. Moses obeyed because he saw the bush. The disciples followed because they witnessed signs, and Elisha's servant rested because he saw horses of fire. Dothan today is an archaeological site in Israel, identified as Tel Dothan, about 22 kilometers north of Nablus in the West Bank. Excavations carried out in the 20th century revealed human occupation dating back more than 5,000 years. The walls that existed in Elisha's time turned to dust long ago. The Syrian horses that surrounded the city are anonymous bones somewhere in the soil of the Middle East. Of the soldiers who marched during the night to capture a prophet, not even the memory of their names remains, but the text of 2 Kings remains. It is read in synagogues, it is preached in churches, it is studied in homes around the planet. Each generation that encounters this narrative receives the same information that the servant received that morning. There is more than the eyes can process. The visible world is only a fraction of what exists, and in the space between what we see and what there is, forces operate that completely change the equation of any situation. The writer to the Hebrews, centuries after Elisha, would describe angels as ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation. It was not poetic language. It was functional description. The same God who positioned horses of fire around a prophet in Dothan continues commanding armies that do not appear in news reports, that are not detected by satellites, that do not enter into strategic calculations of any nation. But they are there. They always have been. The difference between the terrified servant and the serene Elisha was not courage. It was information. One knew of something the other ignored. You are surrounded right now, by problems perhaps, by uncertainties, by threats that seem larger than your resources to face them. The question was never if there are forces around you. The question is, which forces are you seeing?